We do have a ton to get through in this episode.
Common sense is finally prevailing.
There was controversy this month, Dave.
I'm not particularly excited by that.
Secrets and things on set.
I haven't told them anything.
I think this is just good times all round.
Every Doctor Who is liked by somebody, and that's a really good thing.
Davo, my doctor.
I know we disagree on this one.
First world problems, Dave.
I get why fans are asking those questions.
Oh gosh, that's actually quite a lot to talk about.
It doesn't compute.
It's the elephant in the room.
That's okay.
Fandom versus the BBC.
The cardinal sin.
Moving along.
Lunch. Hello and welcome to the Doctor Who show for November 2024. I'm Dave.
And I'm Rob. Why are we talking so slowly?
I don't know, but for this month we will be doing a topic on writing Doctor Who, and specifically this month Bob and Dave are talking Bob and Dave.
It's about time we did this one. Of course, listeners, we've done several Doctor Who writers in the past. They've all been fun episodes, but we've never done Bob and Dave. We've threatened to before. Tonight, we're following through on that.
We are. So we will be having a chat in our main segment about Bob Baker and Dave Martin. Before that, though, Rob, you're well?
Very well, Dave. Very well. Fighting fit.
Yes, excellent. Good. I am too, not that you asked. But
you didn't give me a chance.
Oh, look, we've had a very busy month here at the Doctor Who show. We have had our episode on the Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers come out. Yep. We've had a List Makers come out. By the time you hear this, listeners, you will have had our Ask Us Anything live special from Sydney come out. And we've got a lot more coming up. But I should mention, Bob, I should say.
Yes.
Bob. I have guested on another podcast, The Last of Us Set, in fact, where a number of people asked me on their podcasts over the course of this year.
You've been very busy moonlighting, yes.
I have, but all of them about the Virgin books.
Right.
So obviously that's been in fashion a bit this year, so I've been asked to come along and guest on that. The final, of course, was Ian Martin's We're All Stories in the End, where I got to chat about First Frontier, a really good novel that I enjoyed by David A. McKinty. I remember that from when I was about 14, reading it over the Australian summer, and it had aliens and Roswell and 1950s America and The Master, and what more could I want?
And Ace looking so strange on the cover, if I recall.
That gets a good chunk of the conversation, I've got to say, the cover.
Good.
In contrast, Ian was not 14. He was a bit older when he read it and may have had a slightly different perception of it. So please do check that out. But look, whether it's Too Broad and Too Deep, Too Hot for TV, Sirens of Audio, or We're All Stories in the End, I have been around talking about the Virgin books a bit lately.
Yeah, well, that's kind of your thing, isn't it? I mean, that's what you grew up with.
It's the year of the show I grew up with, exactly, Rob. So
yeah.
I'm quite passionate about it. I do have a really soft spot for it in the same way people sort of 15 years older than me have a really soft spot for Tom Baker or John Pertwee, whatever. So, yeah. Absolutely. So please do check those out and check out the other things we've done. Anything from Europe, or should we dive into the news?
Let's dive into the news.
Well, I'm going to talk about a bit of actual Doctor Who, or at least is it canon? Is it canon adjacent? Who knows? Who cares? The point is, we have had a bit of a trail for the 2024 Christmas special, which is only, 4.5 weeks away?
It's coming up stupidly fast.
It's coming up scarily fast. But there was a trailer for the episode Joy to the World by Stephen Moffat that was broadcast on the 15th of November on the Children in Need special. So look, I suspect gone are the days when there's a whole sketch done for Children in Need. This time they just said, hey, this is Shooty and he's going to show you the trailer and tell you to donate some money, which is awesome. We know now that it stars Nicola Coughlan, who I had to look up her IMDb page, and she has been in one thing that I've seen. She played Diplomat Barbie in the Barbie movie.
Right.
Where I think she had as many lines as Shooty Gatwa did.
Right.
So that's the only thing I've seen her in. Look, Rob, you said to me, have you seen this yet, when we caught up in Sydney? And I said, oh, no, I didn't know it had dropped. He said, well, I'll say nothing.
Yes, I did.
Go watch it. You sent me the link. You knew I'd be quite excited. I was quite excited by what dropped. I think, Rob, we want everyone to have the same reaction I did of like, oh, wow, they're doing this. So won't go into any spoilers, but just the news, I guess, is we know a bit more about this Christmas special. It is only 4.5 weeks away, and the trailer looks pretty cool.
Yeah, I can't account for every single listener out there, but with you, Dave, I know you have a particular interest in something, and that something came up in the trailer. And I said with quiet confidence as we sat there at lunch, I think you're going to like what's in the trailer. Yeah.
You're right, I did. You know me well. You know me so
I do.
well.
After almost 10 years, I better.
No, absolutely. So, yes, Joy to the World coming out soon. What have you got for us news-wise, Rob?
I've got something that we both spotted on social media just recently, which was a spy photo from the filming of The War Between the Land and the Sea. And I did some extra research on this spy photo. So block your ears or fast forward a couple of minutes, folks, if you really don't want to hear this, but it's not that spoilerific, really. And Cultbox had this to say about the spy photo, which I've now built up quite a bit, if no one knows what I'm talking about. During a night shoot for the Doctor Who spin-off The War Between the Land and the Sea, spanning the hours of 7 p.m. to 5 a.m., 10th to 11th of November at the Town Bridge in Newport, Wales, an onlooker was able to photograph an actress in an aquatic creature costume. It's unclear whether the creature is a sea devil redesign, but the official description of The War Between the Land and the Sea states that the series includes sea devils. The monster is decidedly more humanoid than sea devils previously depicted in Doctor Who. The actress is likely Gugu Mbatha Raw. And that's all I've got from Cultbox, Dave. Basically, a human-looking sea devil.
Yes, so I'm glad you clarified, Rob, that this may or may not be a sea devil, because we don't actually know for sure, do we?
Yeah, well, that's what Cultbox are saying. I think they're hedging their bets.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, to those listeners who haven't seen it, the best reference point I can give, and this may or may not help you, is either Zill from the Blake 7 episode Trial, hopefully a little bit more realistic, but maybe not much, or the Sophie Aldred lizard character from the Sills and the Seeds of Mordor, or whatever it was called episode. So definitely going into that almost Babylon 5-esque thing of we'll have lots of aliens, but we'll make sure we can see the full expressions and faces of the actors. I guess kind of what they did with the Silurians, Bob. Yes,
Dave. Yes. I've got to say it's a bit of a shame, though. I quite like the Sea Devils look. I know some people don't like it, but I love the Japanese style armour in Warriors of the Deep. I love that they kept a sort of Asian motif in the most recent outing with Jodie Whittaker. I like that vibe for them. I know it's hard to sort of animate them either as an animatronic or maybe as CGI, and it's probably easier to have a human do it, and of course you do get more emotion through the eyes and the mouth and all of that. Thank you, John Pertwee. But I do like that classic design, and it would be such a shame to lose it. Or have we lost it? Or is this just another aquatic creature, as Cultbox suggests? I don't know.
No, I don't know either. I therefore don't quite know what to make of it. Plus, we're talking about a sort of a blurry from a distance at night photograph, so I'm going to wait until I see it. I think if these are the new Sea Devils, Rob, you're absolutely right. It's going to be a case of, well, we've got good actors and actresses to play these characters. We need to put them in a costume. We don't want them to look like a man in a rubber mask. We can't do it with CGI because then we can't get the stuff we want. So this is the compromise we got. If that's the case, like you, I get it, but I'll be a bit sad to lose the classic design. But that's as far as I'm going because, as I say, we don't know anymore.
Could there be a way to have both? Could the Sea Devils have engineered a Sea Devil-human hybrid? And so there are actually Sea Devils in it, and there's also this human hybrid or something, and that's what we've seen.
Or maybe a human and a Sea Devil fell in love, and this is
and loved each other very much.
Loved each other very much, and I don't know whether they were birthed or hatched, but suddenly a creature emerged, and this creature is the sacred, foretold by the prophecy, union of our two species that will bring order to the galaxy or something. Who knows?
And balance to the Force, yeah.
Absolutely. All of those things. In every generation, a human Sea Devil spawn is born.
That's right. Absolutely.
Who knows?
Oh my God, we should get off that.
We should, and move into our short topics. And I'm going to kick us off, as I always do when I've been to a Doctor Who event, because I have. Myself and some friends here in Melbourne went to the Sirens of Audio event with 7th Doctor Sylvester McCoy and TV's Janet Fielding, or Tegan, from the 1980s. And I've got to say, it was a really good event. It was by far the best-selling event that they've done. Having two guests, particularly a doctor, I think was really good. But also, although I've seen Sylvester and particularly Janet before, most recent occasions were at a big professional con where they were sort of wheeled on stage at 5 past the hour with a couple of other guests, thrown a couple of cursory questions, wheeled off stage 40 minutes later. And you don't really get that sense of, I've actually really sort of learnt about this person and got to know them a bit. Particularly when Janet was on stage with Davo at the time. And look, those who've seen Davo and Janet either in docos or in real life or whatever know that they have a certain shtick going. They have a certain sort of Stadler and Wardorf thing that they do. It's like, okay, we've got 40 minutes to kill. Let's do our show. Let's do our thing. Let's make our standard jokes. So seeing Janet by herself in a much longer setting was really, really good. I've really got a sense of getting to know her a lot better. Sylvester McCoy made it very clear that at 82, this will be the last time he does the big flight out to our part of the world, which is understandable.
Yeah,
so
fair enough.
He's been going all across Australia. And it's interesting, he's still very with it. Occasionally sort of lost his thread a little bit or started telling the same anecdote a second time. So hang on, I told this anecdote this morning, didn't I? So, you get that occasionally. But also he's sort of in this place where because he's old enough and quirky enough, if he thinks the question's just stupid and doesn't want to answer it, he can kind of very jokingly just dismiss the question. And it doesn't sort of sound like he's being a bit of a prick and sort of like, I'm not answering that question. Just like, I'll sort of make a bit of a joke about that question. And clearly he didn't want to answer it. Clearly he thought it was silly. But because it's like, oh, it's Sylvester being a bit quirky, he's got a funny answer. Everybody sort of talks about it. So, really good to see him. He and Janet were on stage together for a bit where they did bounce off each other. The big thing that came out of that was they were extremely honest about their views of working with Anthony Ainley and had a lot of comments about what a weird and bizarre and slightly creepy person he was. Which was, and it's when you see those sort of things that, I mean, A, you sort of go, ooh, a bit of gossip, but B, you also sit there and go, okay, we're getting some honest views here now. And again, Janet talking about John Nathan Turner, and there was a really good discussion where Janet was talking about the John Nathan Turner she worked with, who had just become a producer. He was still learning the ropes. He was not lacking in confidence, but still sort of learning his trade. He was very hands-on and very involved in every decision, the costumes and the scripts and everything. And Sylvester saying that by the time he worked for John Nathan Turner, John was sort of like, look, I'm going to worry about my things. I'm going to keep this show on the road, but I'm not diving down into all these little decisions. And, the actors and the writers and everything were able to get on with things a lot more. So that was a really interesting contrast between the two. So look, it was very entertaining. There were some people there that I haven't seen for a very long time. Mark from 42 to Doomsday made his first appearance at one of these for his first appearance at the Sirens of Audio event, which was very cool.
Nice.
And at the end, they did announce their next guest is going to be Matthew Waterhouse in March. Long-time listeners to the podcast will know I'm a big fan of Matthew Waterhouse. I grew up at the right age to really get Adric, and Adric meant a lot to me. I've seen Matthew before at a professional con, and even in his 40 minutes on stage, I thought he was just a really informative, intelligent guy who's at peace with all the just nonsense and crap that happened when he was a young actor, and some of the crap that he was responsible for when he was a young actor. He's very honest about that. So again, if you're in Australia, check out the Sirens of Audio for the March Matthew Waterhouse con. Rob.
have a lie down, Dave. Yeah, I mean, Matthew Waterhouse, he's not going to pull Sylvester numbers, but I think for people who are really into him, he is going to be a great get. A very rare person to come out to Australia. I don't think he would have been out here all that often.
To my knowledge, it's just the once.
Just once, yeah, there you go.
I know he did Melbourne, but I don't know if he did any other cities. So, no, he is certainly not as overexposed as somebody like, say, Fraser Hines, who's been out here a bunch of times.
Yes, I think that's going to play into his favour. I think that's excellent. And really good to hear that you had a social experience as well as seeing Sylvester and Janet, something we talked about on Wednesday's Q&A show, if people haven't heard it, is the social aspect to these events. And I think it's just marvellous to hear that you got to catch up with old friends and, get Mark along to an event. I think that's all great stuff.
Yeah, no, it was very fun. A short topic from you, Rob.
Yes, I want to talk about the Season 25 box set and the recent time travel TV sale. First up, I was delighted to get my Season 25 box set recently. Obviously, we got it a little bit after the UK because they have to be shipped down here. And in my case, shipped to a guy who had bought a crate of them and then shipped from him to me. So that added to the time it took.
Yes, they physically have to travel half a planet to get to us, so it does take a while.
Yeah, and when you hear at the end of this episode my What Have You Been Watching, you'll know why I haven't dipped into this box set too much yet. But I want to say two things about it. Number one, we say this every time, these sets are just so full of stuff. It's incredible. You know, there are sets that came out a year or two back and I open them from time to time and think, oh man, there's stuff in here I didn't even know was in here.
Yep.
And I watch something else, I think, oh, that's just marvellous. What a good buy that was. And Season 25 in particular is such an important part of my early fandom. It's a real treat to have it in general. I have watched The Happiness Patrol, as that was the update that Pete McTighe was raving about in months prior to it coming out. And you haven't seen Happiness Patrol yet, probably, have you, Dave?
No, I've watched Remembrance, Silver Nemesis, and I'm 2 episodes into Greatest Show at the Galaxy, but saving Happiness Patrol for when the lads come over and we do our Gin and TARDIS in a couple of weeks.
That's right. So I'll say no more. I'll just say it was really good, done well. And the second thing I wanted to mention was the recent time travel TV sale. That's, of course, the internet arm of Keith Barnfather, who's done all the Mythmakers videos going back to the 1980s. So if you ever want a Mythmakers video or related content, go to the Time Travel TV website. And he recently had this big sale where he marked down a bunch of stuff to £4 a pop. And I picked up The White Witch of Devil's End, which is a 6-part series with Damaris Hayman, reprising her role from The Demons. Obviously, it's set a fair while after The Demons, but it was only £4, Dave. I mean, £4, come on. And I've tweeted about it. I've had listeners say they'd love to hear what I think. Obviously, I haven't watched it yet. I haven't even got into my Season 25 box in a major way yet, but I will get to it. Not sure when it will be, but when I watch it, I'm going to report back on it here, probably as a short topic, sometime in the near future.
That's really good, Rob. I look forward to that. And yes, when I finish the Season 25 box set as well, which I'm sure will be the case by the December episode, I think we'll have a bit of a quick chat about it. I'll say very quickly, though, having watched Remembrance of the Daleks and Silver Nemesis, the new CGI is very nice and very effective, and particularly Remembrance, it's really, really cool. It's nice and interesting to see all the cut scenes and the cut dialogue, but I've got to say my overriding impression of those is I can see why all those scenes were cut and trimmed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's usually the case. I mean, you get a little thrill when you see this stuff the first time, whether it's Doctor Who or whether it's something else. It's like Star Wars and seeing the Anchorhead scenes for the first time or whatever. But the more you watch them, the more you think, yeah, they were right to cut this, whether it's right. Star Wars or whether it's Doctor Who or whether it's something else. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. A final quick topic for me, and this is just going to be a quick rundown of some Doctor Who I've consumed over the last month, because there's just been a few little random things I've dipped into for reasons I genuinely don't understand and can't explain. I watched The Android Invasion. I literally came home and just had this urge to watch The Android Invasion. I thought, okay, might as well. And okay. I've got to say, I absolutely love that story. I loved it again watching it. It's just a great Terry Nation adventure. There's always something going on. The setup's really good. The Doctor sort of working through the problem and getting it wrong a couple of times is really good. I think the Kralls are awesome. The androids are awesome. Some good cliffhangers. I just enjoy this story. I will hear nothing against it.
And you've been there. And you've been to the location.
I have been to East Hagborn, yes, which is a lot smaller than it looks on TV. I listened to the Big Finish story, The Kingmaker. Indeed, for the people who listened to our last episode, Peter Deadman wrote in and said, funny you were discussing history on the List Makers, because Big Finish did a story set during the whole Princes in the Tower thing, and I think you'd really enjoyed it. And I said on the episode, well, don't leave us hanging, Peter. Tell us what the name of the story is. And Peter was kind enough to reply. Dwayne from Sirens of Audio, who's obviously an expert in Big Finish, also sent me a private message and said, oh, yes, you've got to listen to it. It's called The Kingmaker. So I listened to it. It was only about $4 on Big Finish, which was really cool. And yeah, look, that was a fun story. It wasn't what I expected. It was quite a lot more light-hearted and a bit sort of, not as fast. That's certainly too far, but it certainly had. It certainly wasn't the sort of the grim historical, medieval historical that I was perhaps expecting. It's got a lot more heart and soul to it than that. interesting to hear Davison with Perry. That's really cool. There was another companion, Ermintrude or Esmeralda, Eumemeran, Eraman, somebody I'd never heard of and didn't leave a particularly big impression, whatever. That was fine. But yeah, no, that was a fun one, so thanks for the recommendation. And look, yes, we mentioned it, I have started the Season 25 box set. I have 2 episodes of Greatest Show in the Galaxy to watch, and then, yeah, we'll be doing Happiness Patrol as a Gin and TARDIS.
Yeah, fantastic.
Well, we've smashed through our short topics, Bob, so it is now time to get to our main topic. This is our roughly annual look at a Doctor Who writer, or in this case, writers, and so it's time for Bob and Dave to do Bob and Dave.
Yes. I've been looking forward to this one all month, Dave.
It just seems so obvious when we put it that way.
I know, it should have been like our 3rd episode or something.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Let's talk about sort of why we're doing this. Apart from the wonderful titular pun, you know, there's more to it than that. You know, when we first did one of these, we did Terry Nation because I'm a huge Terry Nation fan. I wanted to do a bit of rehabilitation of Terry Nation. The most recent one we did was Mark Gatiss because he's got a lot of stories that have very mixed opinions and there's a lot to say. And I think it's partly similar with Bob and Dave. There's a lot of stories they've contributed. 7 stories as a team, which is what we'll be looking at, noting that Bob Baker did a solo one afterwards, Nightmare of Eden, and some Canine spin-off stuff. But 7 stories across the whole of the 70s is a pretty big deal, and I don't think they get a lot of attention.
No, that's for sure. And I don't know why. Because at least half of their episodes are quite good. At least half the stories are quite good. And they have written so many. In fact, I've got a statistic here in my notes that I'll get to later. It's a bit perplexing why that is. I don't actually have an answer for it.
Yeah, I mean, 7 stories is significant. They've done it across a couple of Doctors, and again, I've got some more stuff to talk about as it comes on. Plus, also, I think there is quite a bit to talk about, and like Gatiss, the perception of their work, I think, is very varied. There are people out there who I think are big fans of most or all of their work. There are people out there who sort of consign them a bit to the junkyard, lock, stock. And there are others who sort of would probably say, well, look, they've got some real classics there and some real stinkers there. And again, they may not be consensus over which are the good and which are the bad. So I think it's a very mixed record and a very rich sort of fan consensus. I mean, and maybe that's part of it. You know, everybody sort of says, oh, well, Malcolm Hulke was a fantastic writer and Robert Holmes was a classic writer and Pip and Jane Baker were terrible writers, you know, whatever. There's a sort of a fan consensus around some. You can put them in a nice little tub.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Bob Baker and Dave Martin don't, I think, have quite that easy box to put them in. Maybe that's part of it as well.
Yeah, that is true. But at the same time, they've done enough that they should be just noticed regardless. And I don't think they're noticed as much. Yeah, quite right on that.
Yeah, and I think part of it, and we're probably moving a bit more into the discussion phase at this point, but part of it is also that every documentary that you see Terrence Dicks particularly talk about these guys on, and Barry Letts as well to a certain degree, there's always that thing of, well, the Bristol boys, Bob Baker and Dave Martin, they were reliable. You know, if the script came in, the first draft was pretty good, the second draft was basically ready to shoot, and so we just got on with the job. There isn't a whole lot of controversy, there weren't a lot of arguments. You know, occasionally things like, I mean, a big part of the 3 Doctors had to be rewritten, but you know, they again, you don't get these documentaries on the DVDs about how this writer fought with this script editor and this thing had to be done and then he took his name off it and a bland pseudonym, and you don't get those stories about them. They just turned up, delivered a script that was filmable, and everyone filmed it and went home.
Yeah. They're kind of like us, Dave, on the podcast. We don't argue, we just get on with things, you know, churn stuff out, good and reliable, set your clocks by us putting episodes out. People have been able to do that for like 9 years now. It's actually quite spooky. We're kind of like them.
The Bob and Dave of podcasting, maybe. Yeah. So perhaps going back half a step, Rob.
Yes.
When you turned your mind to Bob Baker and Dave Martin, where did your mind go first? What were the thoughts that came in? How did they sit in your mind?
Well, I think when people talk about Bob and Dave, people in general, the first thing they seem to get called out for is for creating K9. But as I was never hugely into K9, I don't really think about that side of them, even though I know it's perfectly true. I tend to think about how prolific they were as a team, which we've just been discussing. And these are the stats that I mentioned a moment ago. In terms of classic Who writers, there's only Holmes, Nation, Hulk, and Whittaker who have written more episodes. I mean, just think of all the great classic Who writers who aren't in that list.
Yeah.
You know, Bob and Dave outwrote them all. Yet maybe they don't get thought of as much by the average fan as, say, Dix, Sloman, Fisher, Aronovich, you know, who wrote less. In fact, far less in some cases. Of course, if you extend it to the modern show, RTD and Moffat slip into that top tier as well through simply being showrunners and writing a lot of stuff.
For sure.
But I tend to think of them as these guys churning out tons of stories in the 70s and doing reasonably well at it. That's my sort of gut feeling when you say their names to me.
Yeah, I had some similar thoughts. I did sort of go through the whole, and I didn't quite get the stats, I'm glad you did, Rob, but I did go through the whole, wow, they've written a lot to not really be spoken about all that much. And I did reflect on the Terrance Dicks. You know, I was always happy to commission them because they delivered a script on time and it was sort of, you know, ready to go. They didn't need hand-holding. But, you know, I remind myself they weren't just commissioned by Terrance Dicks. They were commissioned by Bob Holmes, Anthony Reid, Douglas Adams. They worked with Barry Letts. They worked with Philip Hinchcliffe. They worked with Graham Williams. You know, they were hired by a multiple production team. So clearly it wasn't just Terrance Dicks that liked them. It was, you know, they had a reputation, I suspect, in the industry and in television as well.
Yeah, and look, when they first met with Terrance, Derek Sherwin was around at the time.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, I mean, it took him another year of writing 1 or 2 page outlines and sort of sending them in until they got something really right that the Doctor Who team wanted to work with. But the Doctor Who team was interested in them from the days of Terrance Dicks and the later period of Derek Sherwin and all of that. So, yeah, I mean, they were kicking this stuff off when Troughton was still the Doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. So they certainly had some longevity, and you don't get that in television unless you've earned it. So people certainly thought they were doing a good job, and I think they did a good job quite a way along. I'm also very aware that I think there is a bit of a... To the extent there is a fan consensus, and I don't think it's a very large extent, it is probably now skewing a little bit negative. I know I've listened to the Flight Through Entirety guys talk about them on a regular basis during their flight, and they're pretty down on them. Todd as well, who I normally agree with Todd's opinions quite often, but he made the comment that they write 2 good episodes a season, and you know that's sort of, you know, condensed, which you know, looking at it, I think is a bit unfair. But again, I think that's sort of where the conversation's been. But before we get into the general discussion, Rob, anything else?
Yeah, I talk about them meeting up with Terrance and Derek Sherwin and all of that, and I was watching the Mythmakers episode with Bob and Dave, and something that comes across very plainly when they talk about, you know, their initial contact with Who, and even getting deeper into Doctor Who, is I don't think they can believe how far they were able to push things, you know, with their collaboration. This was still the era, Dave, where, you know, armed with a typewriter and a bit of front, you could pretty much talk your way into doing television, or even movies if you were really lucky, but television in particular. It's like it was such a new industry, relatively, that hardly anyone understood the industry. And if you had half an idea and something of an ability to offer and ran into the right person at the right time, bingo, you've got a career. You could say the same could happen today. Someone could write something great and find the right person, but I think the chances have blown out enormously. Everyone thinks they're a talent these days and can write. And not only are there many people who delude themselves today, but I think the industry is just a lot more professional and structured these days, and different. I think the whole concept of how the BBC would make programs in the 60s and 70s particularly, and even into the 80s, is this quaint place that writers today can only dream about, I think.
I think that's right. It's something that we spoke about on our season 24 deep dive last month, that we are still, as you say, in the era of I'll just keep bashing out ideas and send them off until somebody commissions me or I give up, rather than coming through, you know, proper courses and colleges and training segments and all the rest of it. They're just, hey, I'm just going to keep writing and see what makes of it. And if they're a little bit good, someone like Terrance Dicks says, look, mate, this isn't right, but come have a drink and I'll explain to you how to do it better. And yeah, it's a very different industry they came up through.
It's quite remarkable. You're sitting there watching telly and you think, oh, I can do that. you just pull out the typewriter and start writing. It's what people did. It's It's nuts.
Well, it's like Sylvester telling the story at the Science of Audio event about how he was working in the cloakroom and the front office of a theatre, and he would, occasionally amuse people with a few sort of crazy jokes and antics in the bar afterwards. And somebody didn't show up for work one day, and they said, "I need an actor to quickly do something. Who have you got?" And they're like, "Oh, that guy over there in the ticket box is kind of funny. Have him." And it just goes from there.
Yeah, and with Bob and Dave, they met, as far as I'm aware. Bob was working in a little shop that sold stuff, including cigarettes, and Dave would come in. He was working at an ad agency and making loads of money, but he was quite bored with it and wanted to get out of it, and he would come in to buy his cigarettes. And that's how Bob and Dave met. Bob's selling cigarettes, Dave's bored with his ad job, and they get talking, and next thing they decide to write scripts together.
That's so amazing.
Yeah, wow. It's nuts.
It is, and it's just so BBC early 70s.
Yes, it's extraordinary.
So, Rob, let's dive a bit further in. And the first big point that I've got that I want to talk about is, as I was looking at all their stories and assessing what I wanted to talk about, the word ambition came up again and again and again. I'll look at the Claws of Axos and go, wow, the ambition of this. Then I'll look at the invisible enemy and go, wow, the ambition of this. And just consistently that came out. Now, I have some thoughts about how that worked out. But if you were talking about them as writers, their willingness to just throw big, crazy concepts at the wall, I think is actually quite remarkable. And I think perhaps a bit of a hallmark of their work.
Yeah, absolutely it's a hallmark of their work. To the degree where they even have sort of shorthand for it, which I've read and seen in numerous interviews, where one of them will say, yeah, we were basically trying to write Star Wars and giving it to the BBC to do on, the BBC budget. Of course, Star Wars came years after they'd started doing this, so that's not what they were trying to do in the first place. But as an analogy for what they were trying to do, I think it's quite right. They're trying to write this big stuff. Might not necessarily be space opera, like Star Wars, but big ideas and just stuff that the BBC couldn't do. And I think that's where some of the stories, and I'm sure we'll talk about some individually later, I think that's where some of the stories fail, and I don't think that's really on them, because I don't think writers should be criticised for having big ideas. There might be a counter to that, maybe writers should try and write to what the BBC can do, rather than just having big ideas in general. But, I don't know, I like that they have big ideas, Dave. I think that's perfectly true, and I agree.
I think this is worth teasing out, because I get where you're coming from, and in many ways I'm sympathetic to it. I noted down here that when we talk about their big ideas and their ambition, it goes beyond the ideas and goes to just how they tell their stories. Now, I was interested to note that 4 of their 7 stories occur across multiple planets. They're going from Titan to the Baal Foundation, or they're going from Earth to the Black Hole, or Atros to Zeos to the Shadow Planet. They're literally big scale in terms of their geography as well as their ideas. But I'm so conflicted here, Rob, because I do agree with what you're saying. Like, a writer should go out there and write a big story, write the most imaginative story he or she can write, and then it's up to the production team to make it work. But I also look down this list of stories and just go, Claws of Axos, Visuals don't quite pull it off. Mutants certainly don't. Hand of Fear's okay. Invisible Enemy definitely doesn't. Underworld most certainly doesn't. And I just sort of go, did they set themselves up to fail a bit more often than they should have by just not sitting there and going, can we make this a little bit more filmable?
Well, look, let's pick up on the Mutants. I think when I'm watching that, I think the CSO is really bad. I think the cast isn't great. In fact, I've seen it said before today that Jeffrey Palmer's the best thing in it, and he's dead before the first episode's over.
Yep.
So, and yeah, I think Bob and Dave are thinking caterpillars turning into butterflies, something ugly turning into something beautiful. And that's their big idea here. It just doesn't translate. It's one of those stories you hear about and think, I'll give this a go. It can't be that bad. And a few episodes in, and with a few more to go, you realise, maybe it's not so great. But is that on them? I know they wrote it, but they didn't do the CSO. They didn't cast the thing. They didn't direct it. There's a lot that goes into making the Mutants dull. would it be better if it was made on a new budget with a great cast today?
Yeah, I think that's a very good example for the defence. But let me
Yes.
let me give you the Armageddon Factor, where
Okay.
my first experience of the Armageddon Factor, I'm fairly sure, was the Target book.
Sure.
I definitely saw a repeat of it here, I think about 88, but I reckon I had the Target book read to me a couple of years earlier. And in that, one of the big memories I have is that idea of a third planet between Atrios and Zeos that is basically blocking the view of each planet from the other. And the novel really talks about this sort of proper craggy planetoid that is a planet of evil. And in the script, they keep referring to this planet of evil. In the TV show, it's 4 eggs sort of stuck to a very flimsy frame. It's terrible, it's woeful, and it certainly never gives that impression of, oh, this thing could block your view of Zeos from Atrios. It never delivers that. Now, credit to them for having that really cool idea, which as a kid in the novel fired my imagination. Mm-hmm. But should they have sat there and gone, you know what, maybe the BBC budget can't stretch to 3 whole planets, let's make it 2. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, if you want a 1970s example of, oh my God, the money's run out at the end of the season, which is something we talk about a lot on the podcast when we're doing season reviews, I think this is a great one to throw on and study, because I think the Armageddon Factor is the poster child for, oh my God, the money's run out at the end of the season. So even if they were coming up with a big idea, and as you say, when you read the Target novel, just the pure distilled idea is so good. Could it have even been better if it wasn't being filmed last at the end of this big season and there just was a bit more money, perhaps?
Yeah, look, I think that's right. But to expand this idea a little bit further, when they write the Sontaran experiment, now I don't know what the brief was, but clearly they were told 2 parts. Presumably they were told all on location and 1, 2, 3 guest actors. They were clearly told this is the budget saver of the season. I'm not saying it's necessarily their best script, but I think a number of people would say it's their best script. It's certainly a contender for their best script. And when they just write that tighter, smaller, in every sense, story, they write it really effectively. So occasionally, maybe their ambition, whilst commendable, did let them down. Maybe they should have gone a bit smaller, a bit often, because they're clearly very good at it.
Yeah, and yet the Sontaran experiment gets overlooked, I think, a little too much, which I find extraordinary because, 2-parters are so rare and they're easy to watch. It should stand out for those reasons alone. And it's a fun enough runabout. I mean, I've compared it to a fan film we made back in the late 80s in our local club in terms of, a simple plot, just running around a location and resolving something.
For sure.
But you've got to not really think about things too hard at the same time when you watch that. Like, why do they only send 1 Sontaran? Why are they experimenting on humans when the Earth is hardly jam-packed with humans anymore anyway? You sort of pick at it and it's a bit flimsy at the same time. So I have a strange relationship with the Sontaran experiment. I think it should be better regarded, yet I don't think it's maybe as good as you're suggesting. If you're suggesting it's nice and tight and could be one of their best episodes, because I don't think it is.
Yeah, okay, interesting. I'll therefore give you the Hand of Fear,
okay,
which I think is a bit all over the shop for the first 2.5 episodes. But when they get to the TARDIS and it's just the Doctor, Sarah, and Eldrad for an episode and a half, I think that's, again, some of their really best work, because you get a bit more time with that character and you get things brought down tenser. You get the sort of the claustrophobic walk through the caves of Castria, and then the twist with Eldrad and Rokon and all the rest of that. Rokon! So, again, would I want them to not be as ambitious? Absolutely not, because that is clearly their signature, and it's great that they have that in them. But I will throw into the conversation that maybe their best work is their small-scale work.
Well, look, to back that up, I'm forever grateful that the Hand of Fear didn't have the Brigadier flying his spaceship into another spaceship to stop it crashing into Earth, which was something that was originally tossed around as an idea to happen in the Hand of Fear. Thank goodness for Small Mercies. That's the kind of big ideas I think they were having when it comes to stuff like Hand of Fear. Dave, I think a lot of people think of Hand of Fear and just think, oh, well, it's goodbye to Sarah Jane, and remember it for that reason alone. But yes, there are some really good episodes in there. I think Liz Sladen is great in that. I think she's a fabulous baddie, if I can say that. Baddie?
Yeah, I think so. Antagonist, maybe.
Antagonist, yeah, that's a better way to put it. I think it's a really neat story. The final episode might not land quite as well as it could. Maybe that colours people's ideas about the whole story. But I think it's pretty solid. And like I say, there were some bigger ideas kicking around than actually made it to screen.
Yeah, I'm actually the opposite to you. I think that it gets better as it goes along. I think that,
okay.
Although it has that great opening with the whole entire bloody quarry exploding, like that's a great opening. I think it does get a little bit messy from there. Yes, Liz Sladen is great, but I do think that once it becomes the Dr. Seer and Eldrad, that's the best stuff in there, which I think is interesting.
Well, look, let's change tack and talk Three Doctors then, which I think is great. It's fun. It was something new for the show. I think people who have come along in later generations don't really appreciate it for what it is. You know, even I came along into fandom at a time where there were the 5 Doctors and the 2 Doctors as well. They were all things. So the 3 Doctors, to me, has always just been something in that style. But to someone in the early 70s, this would have been a real wow moment. All the Doctors on screen? Like, oh my God, fabulous.
Yeah, I think that the Three Doctors is a wonderful example of the best of their writing. And I think particularly the way they were able to write under pressure, because they were told initially you've got the 3 Doctors, and then they're told you can't have William Hartnell, then okay, you can have him but only on a TV screen for a couple of minutes every episode. Which companions were going to be in it was sort of switched around, and who was going where was switched around regularly. So they had to be able to adjust their script quite a lot on a regular basis. And given that they do that, and still the dialogue between the Doctors is, I think, better than anything in the 5 Doctors, the 2 Doctors, or indeed the however many Doctors were in, what's it called, Day of the Doctor. I think there's some really good sparkling dialogue in there. There's some great stuff with the Brigadier. I think it's really good. Interestingly, though, as well, you mentioned before how sometimes they're not ambitious ideas, but they're bonkers ideas.
Yeah.
Do get knocked back. The fact that they envisaged Omega as being the character Ohm, and he was called Ohm because that's the word who upside down, is clearly a bonkers idea that Terrence Dicks quite rightly said, no, we're not doing that. And then they've gone, oh, Omega? Yep, fine, we'll do that. That's again that thing. But again, you read the Target book, and Omega lives in this sort of what's left of this great garden. And the singularity is this great column of fire and smoke that goes up into a cathedral-like ceiling. And okay, it's filmed and it's a quarry with some very plastic sets and a pissy little bit of smoke going up a couple of metres.
Yeah.
Is that their fault? No. And I think that the Three Doctors is a story that rises above the limitations of the budget, because the ideas are so good, the dialogue's so good, the characters are so good, whereas I think The Invisible Enemy falls down because the big idea that they can't do on screen is the whole premise of the story. The whole premise of The Invisible Enemy is that we're going to go inside the Doctor's bloodstream or inside his brain, and the moment that just can't be realised on screen, the whole story falls in a heap. Whereas, okay, so the filming locations are quarry. Well, so is 80% of Doctor Who. Who cares? That's not fundamental to this story. The 3 Doctors and Omega is fundamental to that story. So when the visuals fall down, who cares? But if you make the story about the visuals and that falls down, that's a problem.
Yeah, well, The Invisible Enemy is a good example of something else as well, which is when we say they're having these big ideas and throwing them at the wall and seeing what sticks. They invent K9, but it's not with the idea that he's going to be a companion. They just invent K9 as a little offsider for the Professor. Professor Marius, isn't it, in that?
Yes, Professor Marius.
Yeah. And there's absolutely no thought that this is going to be a companion. And then the production team are like, oh, well, look, we could do this. We could make it a companion, blah, blah, blah. I find that extraordinary, that they were having such big ideas that even something like K9, which is rooted in Doctor Who history and lore and loads of people love K9 and all this. I don't particularly, but I know loads of people do. And it's just an accident more than anything.
Yes, it is a bit of serendipity. You're right there, Bob. But I also think that K9 encapsulates one of the really good things about Bob Baker and Dave Martin, which is that they got the brief. They knew who they were writing Doctor Who for. They were writing it for the family audience, but particularly the legendary Robert Holmes smart teenager. You know, it's a kid show, but for the kid who is always putting his hand up in class to ask another question. And they got that brief, and I think that K9 absolutely nails that. It's a show that's for, we all hate to say it, but it's a show for kids that adults can also enjoy. But they never forget that audience. I think K9 absolutely encapsulates that.
Yeah. After Invisible Enemy, of course, there's Underworld, so it's worth talking about because I feel Underworld is frustrating because I think, and this will be controversial for some people out there, I think the first episode is all right, and I don't really know why people bag it. Unless they're lumping it in with the later episodes. I think that's a lazy thing to do. But they might be lumping it in as one whole and saying, well, the whole thing is terrible. But I think the first episode is demonstrably better than what comes after it. I mean, what comes after it is that CSO nightmare and awful costumes. The Doctor and Leela even feel off. But again, that's not on the writers, So although they're attached to a stinker, I don't think it's on them. I think what they present, and again, a big idea, these people have got the power of regeneration from the Time Lords, and then we're into a Greek myth analogy. And give me a bigger idea than that. There aren't many out there. It's a huge idea, Dave. I find Underworld quite good, at least in episode 1.
I think Underworld is terrible. And I think that this is one where they have to take a certain amount of the blame.
Okay.
Absolutely the production team that, look, we all get it, out of desperation, delivered what they delivered, takes another part of the blame. But as we discussed when we dived into season 15, I think that this is, by some measure, their weakest script. It's full of lots of very bland characters with sort of terrible one-syllable sci-fi names, Trog, Brog, Hog, or whatever. It's got these sort of ideas that sort of happen and they're not really developed. Yes, it's sort of very clever. And we can call a spaceship the P7E. Get it? Persephone? Like, once you've sort of got over, that's very clever, there's not a lot to it. It's got lots of throwaway ideas. The two giant condom dudes that you're just like, what are they meant to be? Like, we've evolved past, what?
Yeah.
Who are you? What are you? And now you're just a couple of robots with really bad heads. I just think the dialogue there just fails to spark at all. I think they are tired at this point. I think that they are rushed at this point, and it's a weak piece of work that then is completely and utterly shattered by woeful production as well.
Yeah. Oh, look, that's fair, and in no way am I defending the episodes after episode 1. It's episode 1 that captures my imagination, and I think the production isn't too bad on it.
No, fair enough. You're more positive on that than I am, Bob. Something that I wanted to mention here that I really noticed as well is, again, they get the brief about Doctor Who in terms of writing adventures in time and space. And I was going through looking for messaging, politics, that sort of thing, and there's not a lot of it in there. I mean, when it comes to political satire, you've got the character of Chin, who is, if anything, more comic relief than he is political satire. Yes, you've got the Doctor sort of talking about ensuring that we're citizens of the world and a global society and going against the sort of England for the English stuff, and the Mutants is clearly, got a message that says apartheid is bad. It's like, well, okay, that's not, that's a correct message, but is it the most subtle and, probing sort of thought out there? It's
not really profound.
It's not really profound. Maybe the Sontaran experiment, he's saying torture's bad, or maybe that's just a coincidence. Like, and I'm not having a go at them for that, to be very clear. We all know that there are some great Doctor Who stories where messaging and politics can be woven in, but it must serve the plot, and they certainly never let that stuff get in the way. They just go, what's going to keep everybody entertained for 25 minutes on a Saturday night, and let's get on with it. And I think that is not a bad thing for this time.
Yeah, yep, concur with that.
A couple of general points to go through here Bob.
You're enjoying saying that, I think.
I am. I grew up with my father wanted to drop the word Bob whenever he had an excuse to, because he was a big Blackadder fan, so I am enjoying it. I did find when it comes to their writing, they lean into archetypes a lot more than characters. It's often, he's the professor, he's the poacher, he's the doctor, he's the marshal. I don't think that any of those sort of characters have a particularly strong personality or character. There are exceptions. Eldrad, I think, is very well written. A couple of the characters in Three Doctors are very well written. But generally, they're not really into developing the characters all that well.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and possibly the result of them not being professional writers and literally just tossing 1-2 page ideas around until they started being commissioned for scripts, and then just writing scripts, almost getting stuff up on screen as soon as they wrote it. You know, they didn't spend 5 years or 10 years slogging away doing very menial stuff. They were commissioned to write Doctor Who straight away, you know, and they maybe just didn't have the experience.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. It's a very good point. And similar to that, they also don't fall onto the trap of leaning into baddies all that often. The Claws of Axos doesn't really have a baddie. Axos has ill intent towards us, but only because that's its nutrition cycle.
Yeah.
The Mutants has the Marshal. He's clearly a baddie, but there's a whole lot of stuff going on, and it turns out the Mutts actually aren't bad people after all. The Three Doctors has Omega, who's misunderstood. Yep, there's a monster in Sontaran experiment. The Hand of Fear, Eldrad. Is he a baddie? Is she a baddie? Yes, but are they also coming from a particular place? Yes, they are. The virus in the Invisible Enemy definitely isn't a baddie. It's just a virus, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that interestingly in their writing, again, they don't lean on, well, here's my big bad of the week, here's my monster of the week. They do actually have some slightly more interesting protagonists and antagonists. So having said that they don't have very good characters, I do think that they fall outside the cliches of the baddies every week.
Yeah, I agree with that too. It's really interesting when you put it like that, but it's perfectly true, yeah.
And the final thing I wanted to observe before I know you've got a couple of points to sort of take us into our top twos and bottom twos is, again, just looking at the producers that they worked under. Now, I'm not saying Sontaran Experiment and Hand of Fear are their top two stories. I'm absolutely not saying that. But I'm saying I think a lot of fans would have those as contenders of their better two stories.
Yep.
And the fact that they were both produced by Philip Hinchcliffe, who was a very good producer, had a very good budget at the time, may not be a coincidence. Maybe when their scripts do have a little bit more money sloshing around and a producer like Philip Hinchcliffe, they do rise a bit further.
I don't think it can be an accident, put it that way.
No, and maybe as well having Robert Holmes as your script editor. I mean, that can't hurt your script either.
Oh, hell no. No, and they got on quite well with him as well. So I think there was a lot of collaboration and a lot of back and forth, and that's always a healthy thing too, whether you're writing scripts or just in your day-to-day work. If you get on with the people you work with, the results are always better. Yeah,
and I think you're right. I think that these were collaborations, whether it was Dix or Holmes or Reed. These are occasions where they deliver their first draft or their story brief. They come in and over a few cigarettes and maybe a pint over an afternoon, they collaborate and go, well, what if this character did this? What if we changed that to this? How would this work? And then they went away and rewrote it, rather than what would happen with other authors is sort of like, okay, this is as good as you're going to get it. Leave it with me and I'll get out the typewriter and I'll start rewriting this myself. Yeah, precisely. Now, I found it quite interesting, Dave, to think about when they split, because obviously Bob went on to write another story solo after the partnership split up. And I think, well, what did split the partnership up? You know, it was sort of half remembered. And I actually found a quote from Bob. And Bob said that Dave said, look, I don't want to go on doing this. I want to write novels. And Bob says, I thought, dark clouds looming up for me. What's it going to be like writing on my own? I've never done that. And when it came to it, I wished him the best. He wished me the best. And I went towards the production side of things more, script editing and eventually producing at HTV. And he went off and wrote novels. He wrote 4 detective novels, police detective novels that sold reasonably well, I think. But he was a lot happier doing that, being alone in his room and smoking. Yeah, fair enough. I never got the sense that there was a big falling out.
No, that's right.
They just decided they wanted to do different things after a decade working together.
Yeah. Again, to go back to that episode we recorded when you were in Sydney, we were talking about, there's a question, what would stop you reviewing new Doctor Who episodes? And it's like, well, if one of us decided not to do it, the other would, say, well, okay. And that would be that, And I think that agreeable sort of nature we have here on the podcast is the sort of agreeable nature I see between these two. They didn't have a big bust up. It was quite amicable. And as I said, Bob went on to write another Doctor Who story on his own.
Yes, The Nightmare of Eden, which doesn't fall in the Bob and Dave category, but certainly has ambition and certainly has some interesting characters.
Yeah. I think a lot of people appreciate it for what it's trying to do, but maybe just not succeeding.
Yeah, if ever there was a case of a very good idea and script just being destroyed by acting and special effects and director and a lot of things, it's The Nightmare of Eden. Mm. Wow.
Yeah. And of course, Bob would sort of come back into the Doctor Who sphere much later with the Australian K9 series. Now, I'll say up front, I never had any interest in this. I never watched it. What I've seen of it in clips looks absolutely grim. But it's interesting when some UK fans realise you're from Australia. They're always like, oh, hey, how about that K9 show? What did you think of that? As if it was some sort of cultural phenomenon here. And we all must have watched it because, it's Australian. So, of course, we must have watched it. I always feel like I'm pricking their bubble when I'm like, it was a nothing sort of show here as far as I can remember. I don't know anyone who watched it. I don't remember it being spoken about or advertised. And I certainly didn't watch it. The end.
No, I don't remember it being on here at all, but it would have been advertised on a channel that I probably wasn't watching at a time slot that I certainly wasn't watching. So I didn't see it go out, but I have seen a couple of them just, online here and there. And again, I think I can say that when those were produced, they understood the brief. They are made for kids, not just young adults and families. It is a kids show made for kids, and I think that it does that perfectly adequately. I suspect if I had been 6 when I saw that, I would have bloody loved it.
Oh, really?
But I wasn't 6 when I watched it. I was 30-something. And it was like, okay, look, this is interesting. And, oh, look, it's got that actor from Please Like Me. But no, that was as far as I went. I do need to mention as well, Bob, that Dave Martin did write the Make Your Own Adventure book, Search for the Doctor, which has the return of that classic character that we all wanted to see more of, Drax.
Yes.
With, if memory serves, a TARDIS disguised as a Cadillac or something.
Oh, you're stretching my memory now, but it's on my shelf over there. Yep.
Yes. All I remember is K9 Mark III coming on and being activated and it matching the K9 and Company thing. But Dave Martin did come back and write a Make Your Own Adventure book that I did have as a kid, and it is on the shelf somewhere.
Speaking of K9 and Company, in that Mythmakers interview, I don't think they were best pleased with K9 and Company.
I think they were actually quite proprietorial about their work. They were quite offended when Omega was used without their permission in the Arc of Infinity. And when the BBC said, oh, whoops, we're really sorry, here's your check, they said, well, hang on. It's not just about the money, that's our character. And so I think there was a certain pride in their work as well, which is really good.
Yeah, it's good to know.
So, Rob, before we do our conclusion, we do this whenever we have our writers, and the Mark Gatiss one was particularly controversial. Out of the 8 stories that they wrote, what are your top 2 and what are your bottom 2? Let's start with your top 2, Rob.
I'd be surprised if we don't snap here at least once, if not twice.
Yep.
For me, it's the 3 Doctors and the Hand of Fear.
One snap.
Okay.
For me, it's the 3 Doctors and the Sontaran Experiment.
There you go.
Bottom 2, Rob?
Again, I'd be surprised if we don't get 2 snaps. For me, it's the Mutants, and despite my defense of its first episode, it's Underworld. Yeah,
look, a double snap for me. Unfortunately, the Mutants is my least favourite Pertwee, and Underworld is my least favourite Tom Baker. So they are not stories I regard all that well. But I've got to say, as I was going through the list, those 2 did really stand out as being quite clearly below the pack. There were a number that were in contention for my top 2. And even something like the Armageddon Factor, which, look, it's a slog, still has enough cool ideas and bits going all the way through that I'm very happy to defend it. I'm happy to defend the ambition of the Invisible Enemy, even if the production doesn't quite come off. Claws of Axos, some good ideas, some great dialogue from the Master. Some of it doesn't work. It's such a mixed bag.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting... We didn't talk about it, so I'll just briefly say it's an interesting idea. It's got a really cool sort of bright day-glow look. You know, it's got the Doctor and Joe. That's a tick. It's got Unit. That's a tick. The Master's not really needed, though. And it kind of has this disastrous reputation, which I don't think it deserves. I still find it quite watchable. I don't sit there thinking, oh, gosh, this is just the worst thing I've ever seen. I think it's a better story than the production values suggest, that one.
Yeah, look, I think in that first couple of seasons of the Pertwee era, it is the weaker one, but that's against two solid standout, back-to-back, just walls chocked with classics stories. It's got some really good ideas. It's got some really good visuals, as you say. I do think it's got some great dialogue. You know, all the, I might as well fly a second-hand gas stove. And do we have any other options? Well, the usual precautions against nuclear fallout, sticky tape on the windows, that sort of thing. It's got some quite sparkling dialogue in there. And I think it holds together well, but it does, I think, have too much ambition for what it wants to do. And remember, it was pitched as a 7-parter.
Yeah, it was, yeah.
So it maybe just doesn't have enough room to breathe.
Yeah, I agree.
Which I think is a good summary and takes me to my conclusion, which is nothing earth-shattering. I think that they are definitely solid writers. I think they definitely have a style. They should be commended for their ambition. They should be commended for some really memorable ideas. Do they sometimes stretch the production further than it can cope? Absolutely. And when that completely falls on its ass, it really falls on its ass. But with maybe one exception, I would happily put all of these on and watch them. I mean, the Mutants, not that often. Underworld, look, if I'm not watching it for the podcast, I'm not watching it again. Yeah. There's some really good, enjoyable ones. And 3 Doctors, some Tyrant Experiment, Hand of Fear, I can chuck them all on and really love them. Invisible Enemy, in the right mood, I can love that. They've written more good Doctor Who than a lot of people.
Yeah, and for mine, that's just it. I think they're underrated. It's the first word that comes into my head, particularly when you consider, again, they're among the most prolific classic era writers, yet people don't talk about them half as much as other guys who did the same amount of work or less. And it's not even like they were a flash in the pan. They were around for the best part of a decade, writing across the 2 Doctors that they wrote for, a bunch of different companions, and I think their hit-miss rate is about 50-50, and across that number of stories, I think they deserve better than they get from fandom. I think they're a bit forgotten, and I know as soon as I say that, people listening will take that to the nth degree and think I'm saying that no one remembers them. That's not what I'm saying. They're remembered, particularly in discussions about K9. They will come up. I just don't think they're remembered maybe enough.
I don't think they're remembered in proportion to what they did for the show.
That's the way to put it, yes.
I think that's a very good summary. So that was Bob and Dave do Bob and Dave. As always, write in and let us know what you thought about our topic and our discussion. We'd love to hear from you. And in fact, we have heard from a number of listeners. So would you like to kick us off with Matthew's email, please, Bob?
Okay. This is Matthew McCain via our website regarding the top Doctor Who stories where the Doctor overthrows the government. Matthew says, "The one episode I forget all the time, while I'm not sure if it's 100% overthrowing the government, is Heaven Sent. Peter Capaldi stages a military coup, drawing a line in the sand and overthrowing Rassilon."
That's a really good new series example, Matthew. Thank you for that. That's cool.
Yeah, very good.
We have had one here from Nick of the Nine, which came in via email, and he says, "Dear Bob and Dave, again, it was enormously entertaining to hear the views of an erudite cultural critic who is also a Lord of the Rings newbie. Dave's remarks about what works and doesn't in The Two Towers brings the film to life again 22 years later. For what it's worth, I've always thought that the second film is a tremendously successful adaptation of a dull book. The Two Towers is the worst of Tolkien's trilogy, but I thought in some ways the best of Jackson's. He was even able to cut the most exciting scene, no spoilers, and move it to film 3 and still fires us up. But listening to Dave, I felt like Theoden with the scales falling from my eyes. Yes, Pippin and Merry have nothing to do. Yes, the Eowyn Aragorn subplot goes nowhere. Theoden's revival is too magical and doesn't impress as much as actual manipulation would have. And yes, Frodo and Sam are the underrated heart of the trilogy. In light of this in particular, Dave's thoughts on the return of the king should be very interesting indeed, and hopefully at odds with conventional wisdom. Rob, you know what I'm talking about. P.S. It makes one feel dreadfully old to hear the words, "I don't know who Bjork is." Regards, Nick of the Nine.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too, Nick. Don't you worry.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad you appreciated our discussion. I don't know about cultural erudite. I just watched it and gave you my thoughts. So, yeah, look, interesting. And yes, I think that it probably would be a very dull book. And so, yes, it definitely rose above the prose.
They're very long, very heavy books. I'll say that much.
Yes.
All right. A friend of the show, Alex Wilcock, writes in by email, also regarding the top Doctor Who stories where the Doctor overthrows the government. Hi guys, your top 5 times the Doctor overthrows the government was my jam, and Rob's question about what makes a government or a regime made me think. Perhaps the simplest answer is the Doctor more often fights to prevent an invasion or liberate from it, while you are looking at not outside forces but a government oppressing its own. But then you both had picks showing it's more complicated. Your big surprise was only one New Who. Mine was expecting Mac Hulk as the obvious political writer, yet no. Silurian coup aside, he doesn't bring down governments. I can hear the sound of empires toppling is always one of my most iconic Doctorish lines, or should that be iconoclastic? So much a part of him that he seems to be doing it almost as a workout in the Happiness Patrol, even if, as you found, he may not actually do it all that often. But literally, from the very first, the Doctor's favourite period of Earth history was said to be the French Revolution, and I have to assume that's the downfall of the ancient regime, rather than all the blood, which brings me in turn to a New Who suggestion. What about Hellbent, or indeed the Invasion of Time, where the Doctor may be making himself a Time Lord Caligula to save them, but he's also shaking them up a bit? Doctor Who's biggest bad after the Time Lords being Daleks, usually they wouldn't count as he's fighting their aggression against other planets and people. Perhaps the Magician's Apprentice qualifies, as they're shown as just a council, or whatever, in their control room, and he unleashes a revolution of sorts on them.
Yes, but I suspect only so that Moffat can write the line, "Your sewers are revolting."
Yes. I'd forgotten about that line. Now you put it back in my head. But listening to you wrestle with whether to dismiss one story because the Doctor doesn't do enough, my 2 main thoughts crystallised. For the Doctor who most enables others rather than taking charge, and though not technically overthrowing a government, but who very much shapes society, I nominate as the New Who story most in the sort of shape you've discussed, The Long Game. No wonder it was an idea Russell first had in the 80s. But how would I grade the spectrum from active overthrowing through nudging others to affecting events just by being there with unintended consequences? Because Rob made an excellent case for one story that, for me, drops off the too far end of that. Though the Doctor's sent to avert the Daleks in Genesis of the Daleks, does he actively overthrow the Khaleds, the Thals, or Davros? No, in each case, it's the active choice of Davros and the Daleks themselves, though reacting to the Doctor's presence speeding them up a bit. It's a bit like Caves of Androzani, where the President is literally toppled because the Doctor's there, yet at the same time I would completely disagree that he overthrows the government when he knows nothing about it. The working title for that story summed up this paradox. Chain reaction. And for me, the paradox of Genesis of the Daleks is the Doctor, if you'll forgive the mixed metaphors, not aiming to bring down regimes, but tripping over butterflies as he never quite manages to net the Daleks. Happy times and displaces, Alex Wilcock.
I will forgive that mixed metaphor, Alex, because that was quite a fun little reference there. Thank you for the thoughts, Rob. I think it's fair to say we've had a lot of engagement on our top 5 occasions the Doctor topples governments.
Yes, we have, yeah. Good
stuff.
Yeah,
which is good, and please keep that feedback coming. Our next piece comes via YouTube from Constable Hansy, who comments on our Season 25 episode, including some of our news and short topics there, Rob. He starts off by saying, Season 24, well, I guess Delta is passable. Constable Hansy then goes on to say, and I'm with Rob, Grace, Graham and the Doctor. I reckon that was a missed opportunity. They should have killed off Ryan and had a middle-aged couple travel with 13, even if just for half a dozen stories. All kinds of unexplored dynamics could have been tried out with those 3. Killing off Grace so suddenly was a mistake, in my humble opinion. The actress really bounced off Bradley.
Yeah. Oh, look, I completely agree. They were my thoughts too.
Nice.
And now we have Bill McCann III via email. He says, "Hey, Rob and Dave, I never miss listening to an episode, although it's been a little while since I last checked in. Rob's comments on the comic book nature of Paradise Towers had me repeatedly talking back to my iPhone as your podcast played through it, but Rob didn't hear a word I said. He just kept going on about comic books."
He does that.
I do. Now that I've got your attention, please turn it towards the Season 24 DVD extras, specifically Here's to the Future, wherein Andrew Cartmell has a lot to say about how Halo Jones influenced Paradise Towers, so much so that I sought out and read every scrap of Halo Jones I could find. Initially, deciphering dialogue in the comic made for a slower read, but that process also opened up environmental and cultural dimensions of Halo's world that are embedded in the story by way of visual clues. 18-year-old Halo Jones lives in a floating ring-shaped conurbation or housing estate called The Hoop that is moored in the Atlantic Ocean off the east coast of America. I've no trouble seeing Paradise Towers and The Hoop simultaneously existing in the same universe. But no spoilers here. I hope you'll check out Halo. Until next time, Blue Box Bill McCann III.
Nice. I think somebody was definitely on your wavelength there, Rob.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just say, I know Halo Jones, even going back to the Transvision Vamp song. Was it Hanging with Halo Jones or Hanging Out with Halo Jones? There was a song around the time the comic was going that Transvision Vamp put out. So, yeah.
There you go. And our final comment is from another regular, Dylan Mooney, who comments via YouTube on our latest list makers regarding stories that could have featured regeneration instead of what we got. And Dylan says, "Nothing like seeing a new video is up. Really enjoyable and interesting topic. For me, it's the Doctor Falls. Imagine the impact of Capaldi regenerating angrily in the TARDIS. A missed opportunity, as there would be nothing quite like it."
Oh, I agree with that.
Totally agree with that.
Yeah, good call.
So we'll move on quickly to what have we been watching. As I've flagged for a couple of episodes now, Bob, I have been watching and now finished Agatha All Along, the latest from the Marvel Studios, and I've got to say this is definitely in the top 3. In fact, frankly, I think they've only done 3 good TV series: WandaVision, Loki, and now Agatha All Along.
That's a terrible hit rate, Dave.
It's a terrible hit rate, but I'm standing by it. But those 3 are very, very good. This was really, really enjoyable. It was fun. It was camp to the right amount. It was spooky to the right amount. The characters were really good and interesting. There were some real stakes. People died along the way. There were some twists that made me literally just sit up and go, "Oh my God!" And then there was some visuals, and just the way it all came together was really, really good. I think that I heard one comment by one reviewer say that because it was a bit more of a side topic and a bit more low budget, the studio was less keen on checking out, you've got to go cast a name for this, you've got to go cast a name for that. They just left them to sort of cast lower budget, lesser known actors, particularly Joe Locke. I mean, this was only Joe Locke's second piece of television after Heartstopper. He's done a couple of things on stage, but this is his second piece of television, and now he was just absolutely fantastic. Patti LuPone, I was a bit sceptical when I heard Patti LuPone was going to be it. I had sort of J&T casting vibes about that, but she is just wonderful in it. It's a really good cast. I cannot speak highly enough about this series. I'm aware that the vibe won't be for everybody, and it may be a little bit too camp, or a little bit too fantastical for some, and that's fine. But look, I think that a franchise that is struggling generally, but particularly on TV, has really come up trumps with Agatha All Along, so I recommend it. I've been working through season 2 of the new Frasier episodes. I enjoy it because, look, I enjoy seeing those characters and actors on the screen again, but I don't think it's quite got the spark of the first one. And I have finally, after a couple of attempts over the years, finished watching the 1970s drama In the Shadow of the Tower, which was the TV series made after The Six Wives of Henry VIII and Elizabeth R, but a prequel to it. It covers the reign of Henry VII. And linking back to our main topic, it stars James Maxwell from Underworld as Henry VII. Where it's good, it's very good. But unfortunately, they've obviously decided that they were very successful with the first 2 series of 6-parters. So they said, well, why not cash in and make a 13-parter? And there's about 8 episodes of material in there. And where it drags, it really drags, which is why it's taken a couple of goes for me to get through the full 13. But I have I'm glad I watched it. It's not going to be a classic I come back to like Elizabeth R, which I've watched, I don't know, 20 times over the last 30 years quite easily.
Wow. Yeah.
That's a show I absolutely love. But I'm glad I saw it.
Oh, very good.
What about you, Bob?
Yes, for me, I've watched the new series The Lincoln Lawyer, which is a really great courtroom-based series on Netflix, which was originally a series of novels. I think they're still being written, actually. It has a really compelling lead. It's got cool stories. And the Aussie actor Angus Sampson is one of the lead's team of allies in his law office. So that's really cool to see Angus in a big US show. The Diplomat, which I raved about during Season 1 and Season 2, was just as enjoyable. Do note, though, that it has stuff in it that bears zero resemblance to what would happen in reality with regard to politics and, what's going on in the world. But it's still fun to watch. It even does mention real-world things, like it mentions AUKUS at one stage.
Nice.
Which is pretty cool.
I must admit, I didn't know Season 2 of The Diplomat was even being made, let alone came out. So thank you for telling me about that.
Yeah, well, there you go. You can dip in. And did you see the first season?
I saw the first season and quite liked it, yeah.
Oh, okay. You can see what the wash-up is from what was going on there. I say no more. Cobra Kai dropped another 5 episodes just recently, on its way to wrapping up next year. They were as good as ever. And something I've really loved doing recently is picking up new Japanese series on Netflix. These aren't even dubbed. They're in Japanese with subtitles. And the first one I'm going to mention is RO, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, which is kind of like, don't take this literally, but it's kind of like Torchwood meets the X-Files in some ways, but done in a super Japanesey way. I think it's pretty neat. Okura Cold Case Investigation, which is a bunch of misfit police in a basement who are meant to be doing data entry, but one of them keeps engineering evidence to get cold cases reopened so that the guilty can be brought to justice. Again, super Japanese. At times it's near comedy, at other times it's deadly serious, and like you're thinking, oh my god, it's quite bizarre and yet acted in a very soap opera-ish kind of way. It's so strange, but it's very Japanese. And finally, Talentless Takano, which is this office-based comedy. It's got some pretty crude humor in it, but the conceit is there's this woman who has heaps of style and poise, and that's why she was hired, but she knows nothing. Like, she can barely staple documents together. She doesn't understand what the photocopier is. She can't use a computer. And yet she's made a niche for herself in this office. And all the co-workers have to navigate around her being completely hopeless and yet at times coming up with great ideas or saying the right thing at the right time that puts someone on the right track to do something. I'm trying to be non-spoilerific, not that hardly anyone's going to be watching this in our audience, but I'm finding that quite fun too. And part of the fun is all of these are dropping week to week as episodes, so I'm sort of watching them concurrently with Japan at the moment.
Oh, nice.
And that just feels like a cool thing to do.
Yeah.
So that's pretty neat.
No, absolutely. So that's what we've been watching. That's what we've discussed this month. Rob, summer is well and truly coming. Christmas is coming. The New Year's coming. The cricket is coming. And what's coming from the Doctor Who show in December?
Well, An Adventure in Space and Time is going to be our December 29th episode, Dave. Before that, though, earlier that same week, we'll have a hot take on the Christmas episode Joy to the World. And before that, earlier in December, we're going to have, of course, a List Makers and Alternate Galaxies wrapping up our Lord of the Rings watch. Jin and TARDIS, which you've mentioned, looking at the Happiness Patrol's special edition. And, Dave, I think that's probably enough for December. I think that's a bumper crop of shows.
Yeah, plenty more of us to come for this year. So, yes, our December episode, which we'd like to be a little bit easier, a little bit more relaxed as we get towards Christmas. Last time we did K9 and Company. This time we're doing An Adventure in Space and Time, which is 11 years old.
Yeah, I can't believe that.
No, I can't believe that either. So a good time to look back at that particular spin-off of Doctor Who. But that's next month's problem. Until then, I've been Dave.
I've been Bob.
And we'll speak again soon.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
You've been listening to
The Doctor Who Show with Rob and Dave.
Find us online by searching for
The Doctor Who Show.
We also love it when you write in. Drop us a line anytime at hello@thedwshow.net.